In an earlier video, we talked about inflation as a drug, but what about the addictive substances that we commonly refer to when we talk about drugs? And what about their legalization? What would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economic Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria, and this week we're going to be taking a look at what Hayek has to say about the legalization of drugs. All right, so as with any great debate, you've always got at least two different sides to the issue, and different countries in the Western world have taken different approaches. I'll make reference to some of them here and there, but without getting bogged down in too many of the specific details of each country's context, I'll also speak a bit more broadly about the drug legalization debate and then insert Hayek into that debate a little bit later. One of the other things I think we should get out of the way at the outset is the distinction between legalization and decriminalization. So legalization of drugs means that there are no longer any legal prohibitions against the use or the trade of the drug within the limits set by law to the trading of any good. Decriminalization, by contrast, means that the legal system won't prosecute someone in possession under a specified amount. That person may still have to attend a treatment program or even pay a fine, but he'll not have a criminal record. Okay, and this distinction will come up again a little bit later. If I were to start very generally, I would say that the arguments adduced in favor of drug legalization tend to be of the consequentialist variety, focusing on the economically positive or socially beneficial outcomes of drug legalization. The arguments, by contrast, against drug legalization tend to question the beneficial outcomes, or they tend to be arguments of a more moral variety. So let's start with some of the pro-legalization arguments. For one, as legalization supporters will point out, the distinction between a legal and an illegal substance can be rather arbitrary. Alcohol in the United States, for example, is a factor in 40% of violent crimes and 40% of traffic fatalities, and yet it's legal. It can make people far more belligerent than a group of people sitting around smoking a joint and listening to Pink Floyd. But even despite the sometimes arbitrary distinctions between legal and illegal substances, some will argue that bringing a substance over from the illegal to the legal category is beneficial because it will reduce revenue for organized crime. It allows the substance to be brought into the market where there are rules and laws governing fair behavior. And of course, legalizing goods means the government can tax them and raise revenue. One of the arguments being put forward in South Dakota, for example, for legalizing marijuana and regulating it is that it will increase state income to pay for schools. So drugs could fund your education. Others make the same argument from a different angle and say that there's been a lot of waste in criminalizing certain drugs, such as marijuana, and that legalizing it would save millions of dollars and allow police to focus on more serious threats to public safety. This is one of the arguments put forward in New Jersey. So the argument here is that criminalizing drugs, or some drugs at least, in the first place, has been highly counterproductive and economically inefficient. So by legalizing them, the state can make more money and ensure safety through regulation. Another argument in favor of legalization is that drug users are typically nonviolent, and yet they're still incarcerated at disproportionately high rates, which, so the argument goes, has a disproportionately greater impact on minority groups. And in any case, even if all of these arguments aren't enough to persuade you, some will point to dramatic shifts in public opinion, particularly among millennials. So a Pew study looking at the United States found 53% supported legalizing marijuana against 44% opposing it in 2015. And this is in contrast to 60% opposing it in 2006. What all of these arguments point towards is a public health model akin to what they have in Portugal, which I suppose would be the other end of the spectrum here. What this implies is a fundamental shift in attitude in respect to drugs in the first place, treating them as a medical issue instead of as a criminal problem. Portugal was the first country, all the way back in 2001, to decriminalize the consumption of all drugs. I stress as well here, though, the word decriminalize, because in this instance, drug trafficking is still very much illegal there. They're not condoning drug use, but just taking a step towards promoting medical treatment for drug users. And so what does this look like? I'm going to cite an article which I've provided in the description that was published a few years ago in Time magazine. And it says, under the 2001 law, drug dealers still go to prison, but anyone caught with less than a 10-day supply of any drug, including marijuana and heroin, is typically sent to a local commission consisting of a doctor, lawyer, and social worker, where they learn about treatment and available medical services. And in Portugal, no distinction is made between hard or soft drugs, or whether consumption happens in private or public. What matters is whether the relationship to drugs is healthy or not. Okay, so have they been successful? Well, according to that same article, the drug-induced death rate in Portugal has dropped to 5 times lower than the EU average and is 1/50th of what it is in the United States. And also, crucially, drug use has declined among 15 to 24-year-olds, which is the demographic most at risk of starting to use drugs in the first place. And Portugal isn't the only place with drug centers. Switzerland, France, Germany, Spain, and Greece have also opened drug-using rooms where users receive help in taking drugs safely. The argument here is that eliminating the criminality and stigma of drug use allows people to seek assistance more easily, and people under such a system are treated with more dignity. So we have a moral argument that's also been packed in with a consequentialist argument. All right, but now let's take a look at the other side of the debate, the people who are against the legalization of drugs, and see what they have to say. So one of the arguments here is against legalization is that its putative benefits are exaggerated, or that they emphasize only the positives, or that they're just downright wrong. For example, since the legalization of marijuana, places like Colorado, Seattle, and Portugal as well, have seen increases in violent crime and traffic fatalities. In Colorado and Seattle, when it comes to violent crime, this has been at a rate 2.5 times faster than the national average. And again, in Colorado, when it comes to marijuana-related traffic fatalities, they more than doubled from 2013 to 2016, rising from 55 to 123 deaths. Another argument is that mass incarceration for drug use or possession is grossly exaggerated. In New York City, for instance, of the thousands prosecuted for marijuana possession in 2017, less than 1% of them, so 38 people in total, ended up in prison. Another argument is that mass incarceration for drug use or possession is grossly exaggerated. In New York City, for instance, of the thousands prosecuted for marijuana possession in 2017, less than 1% of them, so 38 people in total, ended up in prison. And yet another argument against legalization is that according to some, the war on drugs in the US is, in fact, working, with the drug use rate dropping by 1/3 of what it was in the 1970s, including a 40% decrease in cocaine use and a 50% decrease in meth use. If we cross back over to Europe, the Netherlands saw use rates doubling among 18 to 25-year-olds after legalization. And finally, a black market, as well as gangs, will continue to exist. Ironically here, one of the reasons for the persistence of the black market are the strict regulations and increased costs associated with licenses, taxes, etc. In some cases, it might just be too costly to run the business legally. And this raises an interesting point, because many of the arguments in favor of legalization still assume that drug use as such is bad. They argue that drug use should be legalized as a means of getting people the help that they need. And this is the idea that people shouldn't be punished, but rather rehabilitated and re-educated. And if you legalize them only to tax them exorbitantly, then that still indicates your ethical opposition to drugs, or at least your ethical opposition to addiction, and that your goal is still to limit the consumption of this particular product. And on this score, there's also probably a distinction that needs to be made between different kinds of drugs, some of which are more addictive and destructive to the individual than other drugs. All right, so this is a good point for us to bring in Hayek. Now, unfortunately, Hayek doesn't have very much to say about drugs specifically. In terms of his personality, he was a rather reserved and conservative man, so his lifestyle wouldn't have indicated any particular support for the legalization of drugs. However, in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, he does mention drugs twice. The first time is in the context of his discussion of the problems with democracy, particularly the legislative branch. You'll recall in that video that one of Hayek's complaints was that civil servants and bureaucrats had increasingly been given the tasks of legislation, while the legislators, the elected representatives, were concerned with seeing through particular measures in order to remain popular and stay in power. So the legislators weren't actually legislating, is the complaint that Hayek has there. And Hayek goes on to say, no less significant is it that when parliaments have to deal with true legislation concerning problems on which strong moral convictions exist, and which many representatives regard as matters of conscience, such as the death penalty, abortion, divorce, euthanasia, the use of drugs, including alcohol and tobacco, pornography, and the like, parties find it necessary to relax control over the voting of their members. In effect, in all cases where we really want to find out what is dominant opinion on major issues rather than the views on particular measures. All right, so in this case, Hayek doesn't himself take a position on drug use, but simply states that it's an issue on which people have strong moral convictions and that legislators should therefore deliberate and decide based on the formulation of general rules and principles. But what about the other occasion in Law, Legislation, and Liberty where Hayek discusses drug use? Well, that's when it comes to certification or licensing of particular activities by government. And on this, he says the following: it can hardly be denied that the choice of the consumer will be greatly facilitated and the working of the market improved if the possession of certain qualities of things or capacities by those who offer services is made recognizable for the inexpert, though it is by no means obvious that only the government will command the confidence required. Building regulations, pure food laws, the certification of certain professions, the restrictions on the sale of certain dangerous goods, such as arms, explosives, poisons, and drugs, as well as some safety and health regulations for the processes of production and the provision of such public institutions as theaters, sports grounds, etc. All of these things certainly assist intelligent choice and sometimes may be indispensable for it. Okay, so there's an ambiguity here, because to begin with, it depends on whether one can define drugs as dangerous or not, or which drugs are dangerous and which are not. At the end of the day, if we remember what we had discussed in our Morality in the Market series, my sense, though, is that Hayek would err on the side of personal responsibility when it comes to drugs. It's your choice. He might see room for regulation when it comes to more harmful drugs, and I think that given his traditionalism, he might consider it problematic if a drug is destroying communities. But otherwise, I think his philosophy would have to permit not just the decriminalization of the softer drugs, at least, but their full legalization. And that's what Hayek would say.
This guy is awesome. He's got a lot of great stuff to say. I hope you've really been enjoying our videos. If you have, and if you'd like to hear what Hayek has to say about something else, anything, then let me know in the comments. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends.